Hello. Tonight, we begin with the most fascinating fairy tale. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. At the uttermost parts of the sea, far beyond the boundaries of ordinary human endeavor, two mighty ships were sent toward the uncharted crown of the world, the North Pole. Their mission was to trace the limits of sea and land, to discern how far the courage and endurance of humankind might press into that silent kingdom of frost and mystery. It was an age of explorers, when the thirst for knowledge burned brighter than the hearths they left behind. A year and a day had passed since their departure. They had sailed through roaring tempests and seas of drifting ice, through fog thick as sleep and winds sharp as glass. Now, winter had returned with relentless sovereignty. The sun, their faithful companion through every voyage, had vanished below the horizon. Night, long, absolute, unbroken, descended like a curtain over the polar world. Weeks would pass before its first faint light would dare to return. The ships were imprisoned in a boundless, white plain, frozen fast to the surface of the sea. Around them stretched a wilderness of ice, towering ridges and glittering deserts, sculpted by the hand of the eternal cold. The sailors, resigned to their fate, built huts from packed snow and shaped them like beehives. Some large enough for a crew to gather, others so small that only 2 or 3 men could huddle together for warmth. Though surrounded by night, it was no darkness they lived in. The northern lights danced above them in 1,000 shifting hues: crimson, sapphire, emerald, and gold, rippling across the heavens like banners of celestial fire. The snow below caught their colors and reflected them in shimmering brilliance, so that even in the deep of night, the whole frozen land glowed with a radiant twilight that never truly ceased. At the height of that spectral brightness came visitors, figures unlike any they had seen, natives of the north, wrapped in thick furs, their faces half hidden beneath hoods of animal skin. They rode upon sleds carved from blocks of ice, drawn by sturdy dogs that barked joyfully at the strangers. They carried bundles of pelts, reindeer hides, and seal skins, warm treasures that the sailors gladly traded for iron, knives, and beads. These skins became the sailors' rugs and blankets, soft barriers between their weary bodies and the cruel breath of the Arctic wind. Outside, the air froze one's breath to frost. But inside, the snow huts flickered small lamps of whale oil, casting golden halos upon the white, curved walls. In such moments, when silence fell, and only the wind howled faintly in the distance, the sailors' thoughts drifted homeward. They imagined the world beyond the ice, the orchards of autumn still glowing with russet and gold, the quiet villages nestled beneath crimson leaves, and the warmth of hearth fires that painted orange light upon cottage windows. It was hard to believe that somewhere far away, children still played in fields, and women gathered harvest fruits beneath the lingering sun. Inside one of the snow huts, 2 sailors lay wrapped in their furs. The younger of the 2 held close a precious keepsake, a small, worn Bible, the gift of his grandmother on the day he had left home. It was his treasure, his talisman, the silent voice of comfort that had followed him from the gentle meadows of his birth to the desolate plains of ice. Each evening he read a passage, and each night he placed the book beneath his head before sleep. From childhood, he had known those words by heart, and one verse above all others dwelt within him like a living fire. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there shall thy hand lead me, and thy right hand shall hold me. He whispered those words into the darkness, and they seemed to glow in his mind brighter than the northern lights themselves. Under their power, peace came over him. His eyelids grew heavy, and the pulse of the cold world faded from his hearing. He slept, and in sleep, he dreamed. In his dream, he felt that though the body rested, the soul never truly slept. It wandered free, alive with memory and longing. He heard music, faint and distant, songs from his homeland, hymns his grandmother used to hum beside the fire. A soft summer breeze touched his face, carrying the scent of grass and orchard blossoms. Then, slowly, the snowy roof above him grew luminous, transparent as crystal, until he lay beneath a radiance like dawn itself. From that light descended a figure, an angel, vast yet gentle, its wings unfolding like sails of pearl. The angel's face shone with the calm of eternity, and in its eyes was the tender knowledge of every sorrow and every joy the young sailor had ever known. The holy being bent over him, and from the open Bible at his side rose a glow, as if a flower of pure light had blossomed from its pages. The angel's hands extended, and the walls of the snow hut dissolved into mist, thinning like morning fog under sunlight. Suddenly, he stood again in his homeland. Around him stretched green meadows, rolling hills, and red-brown forests bathed in mellow autumn light. The storks' nests were empty now, but apples clung to the branches of wild trees, their skins glimmering with frost. Red rose hips shone in the hedges, and through an open window he heard the familiar whistle of the blackbird in its cage. His heart leapt. It was the very bird he had taught to sing as a boy. And there, just as before, sat his grandmother, her silver hair wrapped in a kerchief, twining chickweed through the cage bars as she always did for him. Near the well stood the blacksmith's daughter, the one whose smile had haunted his memory, even amidst the ice. Her cheeks were flushed with the cool air as she drew up water, sparkling in the bucket. She waved toward the cottage, and the old grandmother beckoned her inside. Together, they read a letter that had just arrived, a letter from the far north, sealed and stamped with a name they loved. It told of peril and courage, of a young sailor who yet lived beneath the protection of God, even in the frozen ends of the earth. They laughed, they cried, their hands trembling with joy. And the sailor, though his body still slept beneath the snows of the Arctic, saw and heard it all. He felt their joy, their tears, their faith. He was both present and afar, embraced by love that distance could not sever. From the letter, his grandmother read aloud the very verse that lay open beside his resting head. Even at the uttermost parts of the sea, his right hand shall hold me fast. At those words, the angel's wings curved downward, folding around him like a soft veil of light. A psalm rose in the air, sung not by mortal voices, but by something eternal, harmonious, serene. The melody flowed through his dream until all sound faded into peace. When the dream ended, darkness returned. The snow hut stood silent once more. The lamp burned low, and frost glittered faintly on the walls. But beneath the sailor's head lay his Bible, and within his heart still dwelt faith and hope. God was with him, and through that faith, his home, his loved ones, and all the warmth of life itself were with him too, even at the uttermost parts of the sea. The Moneybox. In a wide and cheerful nursery, where daylight often spilled through the curtains and toys lay scattered like tiny monuments of a forgotten kingdom, there stood, upon the very top of a towering wardrobe, a clay figure in the shape of a pig. It was not an ordinary pig, mind you, but a money pig, a noble creation of the potter's art, baked to a rosy hue and polished until its rounded sides gleamed faintly in the sun. Upon its back was a narrow slit, carefully cut, through which pennies, shillings, and on fortunate occasions, even bright silver crown pieces had been dropped. So eager had its little owners been that the slit had been widened with a penknife, and now it could swallow coins of almost any size. Inside, the pig was full, so full that when gently shaken, it no longer rattled, which, as everyone knows, is the highest and proudest state a money pig can attain. From his lofty perch, he surveyed the nursery world below. The rocking horse with his faded mane, the painted soldiers standing in stiff formation, the dolls with their bright yet lifeless eyes, and the wooden blocks stacked like ruined towers. To the pig, they were all trifles. He knew, oh, how well he knew, that within his round belly rested enough money to buy every toy in the room. And this thought filled him with a grave and swelling pride. He looked down upon them all as though he were a banker gazing from the window of his marble office upon the humble folk in the street. The other toys were not blind to his importance. They said nothing, of course, for it was not considered polite to mention such matters, but each felt it in silence. The big doll, for instance, still handsome, though somewhat faded by years of play, lay half hidden in an open drawer of the cabinet. Her neck had been broken and carefully mended with glue, leaving a pale seam that she covered modestly with a ribbon. She looked out at the others and called in her high, pleasant voice, "Let us play at being men and women. That is something worth doing." This suggestion caused a ripple of excitement throughout the nursery. Even the old engravings hanging on the wall seemed to tremble within their frames, as if they too wished to join in the fun. They turned slightly, showing their gray, unpolished backs to the room, something they would never have done deliberately, for pictures, like people, prefer to show their best side. It was late, so late that the children of the house were fast asleep, but the full moon poured her silver light through the window panes, giving them a brightness that cost nothing at all. It was, as the toy wagon said, light at a very cheap rate. Every toy that could move or speak was invited to join the game. Even the wagon, a rough and heavy thing usually left for outdoor play, rolled forward proudly. "Each of us has value," it said in a deep, wooden voice. "We cannot all be noblemen. Some must work, or else nothing will move." The money pig, being the highest and most dignified of them all, was the only one to receive a written invitation. A verbal message, the others thought, might seem disrespectful to such an eminent personage. The letter was written on a torn bit of picture book page, folded neatly and carried up by the jumping jack. When it reached him, the money pig nodded grandly and sent his reply through the same messenger. "If I am to take part," he said, "it must be from my own home. I do not descend. Arrange matters accordingly." So they did. The little toy theater was brought forward and positioned so that the pig, from his high throne, could look directly into it. The curtain, a scrap of old silk, was drawn. The stage lamps, made of marbles wrapped in foil, were lit, and the audience took their places. Some proposed beginning with a cheerful comedy, while others wished for a tea party and an intellectual discussion afterward. The decision was made to start with the discussion, for they felt it more dignified. The rocking horse spoke first, talking of races and the proper training of young riders. The wagon rumbled about railways and steam power, for such were matters of his craft. The clock upon the mantel chimed in with politics, ticking pompously and declaring that he alone knew what time it truly was, though it was whispered behind his back that he often ran slow. The bamboo cane, standing in the corner, was too proud to speak. He only glimmered with vanity, polishing his silver top against his brass ferrule. Two embroidered cushions on the sofa sighed quietly, being too pretty and too foolish to think of anything to say. Then the play began. The little marionettes danced upon the stage, their painted faces gleaming under the candlelight. Every toy watched breathlessly. They were told to applaud when pleased, to stamp, to rattle, or to crack if delighted. "I only crack for the young and lively," said the riding whip disdainfully. "Old people bore me." "I crack for everyone," shouted the Christmas cracker proudly. "Yes, and what a racket you make," muttered someone from the audience. Yet the show went on, delightful and absurd. The puppets sometimes leaned too far beyond the lights because their wires were too long, but no one minded. The doll in the drawer grew so excited that her mended neck burst open again. The money pig, though motionless, was deeply stirred. "Such talent," he thought. "I must do something null in return." And so, with great solemnity, he decided that one of the performers should be mentioned in his will, to be buried with him in the family vault when his time should come. The idea pleased him immensely. It gave his life a sense of grandeur and importance. The comedy ended in thunderous applause. The toys were so pleased that they forgot all about the tea party, preferring instead to continue their intellectual play, as they called it. pretending to be men and women. There was nothing wicked about it, for after all, it was only a game. Yet even as they played, each thought chiefly of themselves, and some, with hidden envy, wondered what the money pig might be thinking. But the pig thought only of his will, his burial, and the great solemn day when all his riches would rest with him forever. Alas, that day came sooner than he dreamed. As he pondered these lofty things, a tremor passed through the wardrobe. Perhaps a door slammed. Perhaps the wind stirred. But whatever it was, down fell the proud money pig from his high place. He struck the floor with a crash and shattered into a dozen glittering fragments. Out leapt the coins, clinking and rolling in wild delight. The small copper pennies spun like tiny tops upon the floor. The silver pieces rolled boldly away, exploring corners they had never seen before. One great crown piece, who had always longed to travel, rolled straight under the door and out into the world beyond. "Freedom!" he seemed to cry as he disappeared. By morning, the nurse swept the broken clay into the dustbin, whispering, "Poor fellow, he was too proud for his shelf." Yet on the very next day, a new money pig was brought home, fresh, unchipped, and beautifully glazed. It took its place upon the same high cupboard. It had no coins within it yet, and therefore, like the old one, it could not rattle. But perhaps it would learn, in time, that fullness is not the only measure of worth. And thus ended the tale of the proud money pig, a creature who stood high above the rest, yet never learned to look kindly upon what lay below him. A leaf from heaven. High up in the thin, clear air, there flew an angel bearing a flower from the garden of heaven. As he kissed it, a tiny leaf drifted down into the muddy soil in the middle of the wood. It very soon took root there and sprouted and sent up shoots among the other plants. "That's a funny kind of slip," said the plants, and neither the thistle nor the stinging nettle would have anything to do with the stranger. "It must be some low kind of garden plant," they said, grinning and making fun at it. But it grew and grew, and like no other plant, its long branches spread far about. "Where do you think you're going?" said the tall thistles, who have thorns on each of their leaves. "You're taking a good deal of space. That's a lot of nonsense. We can't stand here and support you." When winter came, the snow covered the plant. But from it, the blanket of snow received a glow, as if the sun were shining from below. Then the spring returned, and the plant was in glorious bloom, more beautiful than any other in the forest. And now there came to the forest a professor of botany who could show what he was with many degrees. He carefully inspected the plant and tested it, but decided it was not included in his system of botany. He could not possibly learn to what class it did belong. "This must be some unimportant variety," he said. "I certainly don't know it. It's not included in any system." "Not included in any system?" said the thistles and the nettles. The big trees which grew round it heard what was said, and they also saw the tree was not one of their kind. But they said nothing, good or bad. And that is much the wisest course for stupid people to take. Then a poor, innocent girl came through the forest. Her heart was pure, and her understanding was glorious with faith. Her only inheritance was an old Bible. But from its pages, the voice of God spoke to her. "If people wish to do you evil, remember the story of Joseph. They had evil in their hearts, but God turned it to good. If you suffer wrong, if you are despised and misunderstood, then you must remember the words of Him who was purity and goodness itself, and who prayed for those who struck Him and nailed Him to the cross. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." She stopped before the wondrous plant, whose great leaves gave forth sweet and refreshing fragrance, and whose flowers glowed in the sun like a wonderful firework of color. And from each flower there came a sound, as though it held, concealed within itself, a deep well of melody that thousands of years would not empty. With devout gratitude, the girl gazed on this exquisite work of the Creator and bent down one of the branches that she might examine the flower and breathe in its sweetness. And a lovely light burned in her soul. It seemed to uplift her heart, and she wanted to pluck a flower, but she had not the heart to break one off, for she knew it would soon fade if she did. So she took only a single green leaf, carried it home, and there she pressed it in between the pages of her Bible, and it lay there quite fresh, always green, and never fading. It was kept in the pages of that Bible, and with that Bible it was placed under the girl's head when, some weeks thereafter, she lay in her coffin. On her gentle face was the solemn peace of death, as if the earthly remains carried the imprint of the truth that she now was in the presence of her Creator. But the marvelous plant still bloomed in the forest. It looked almost like a great tree now, and all the birds of passage, especially the storks and the swallows, bowed down before it. "That thing is taking on foreign airs now," said the thistles and the burdocks. "We never act like that here in this country." And the black forest snails spat at the plant. Then the swineherd came, collecting thistles and other shrubs, to burn them for their ashes. He tore up the heavenly plant by the roots and crammed it into his bag. "I can use that, too," he said. And no sooner said than done. But for years, the king of that country had been troubled by a deep melancholy of spirit. He kept busy and laborious always, but it seemed to do him no good. They read books to him, deep, and learned tomes, or the lightest and most trifling they could find, but nothing did any good. Then one of the world's wisest men, to whom they had applied for help, sent a messenger to explain to the king that there was but one sure remedy that would relieve and cure him. In a forest, in the king's own country, there grows a plant of heavenly origin. Its appearance cannot be mistaken. And then the messenger brought out a drawing of the plant. It would be easy to recognize it. Its leaves are green winter and summer. So every evening, put a fresh leaf on the king's forehead. His thoughts will then clear, and a beautiful dream will refresh and strengthen him. I think I took it up in my bundle and burned it to ashes a long time ago," said the swineherd. "I just didn't know any better." "You did not know any better," they all said. "Ignorance. Oh, ignorance. How great you are." And those words the swineherd might well take to heart, for they were meant for him and no one else. Not a single leaf of that plant could be found. No one knew about the one leaf that lay in the coffin of the dead girl. And the king himself, in his terrible depression, wandered out to the spot in the woods. "This is where the plant grew," he said. "It shall be a sacred place." Then he had it surrounded by a golden railing, and a sentry was posted there by day and by night. The professor of botany wrote a thesis on the heavenly plant. As a reward, he was gilded all over, and that gilding suited him and his family very well indeed. As a matter of fact, that was the pleasantest part of the whole story, for the plant had disappeared. The king remained as melancholy and sad as before, but then he had always been that way, said the sentry. Clumsy Hans. Out in the country there was an old mansion where an old squire lived with his 2 sons, who were so witty that they thought themselves too clever for words. They decided to go out and propose to the king's daughter, which they were at liberty to do, for she had announced publicly that she would take for a husband the man who had the most to say for himself. The 2 brothers made their preparations for 8 days beforehand. That was all the time they had, but it was enough, for they had many accomplishments, and everyone knows how useful they can be. One of them knew the whole Latin dictionary by heart, and the town's newspaper for 3 years, so well that he could repeat it backward or forward. The other had learned all the articles of law and knew what every alderman must know. Consequently, he was sure he could talk of governmental affairs, and besides this, he could embroider suspenders, for he was very gentle and also clever with his fingers. "I shall win the princess," they both said, as their father gave each one of them a beautiful horse. The one who had memorized the dictionary and the newspapers had a coal-black horse, while the one who knew all about governmental affairs and could embroider had a milk-white one. Then they smeared the corners of their mouths with cod liver oil to make them more glib. All the servants assembled in the courtyard to watch them mount their horses, but just then the third brother came up. For there were really 3, although nobody paid much attention to the third, because he was not so learned as the other 2. In fact, everybody called him Clumsy Hans. "Where are you going in all your Sunday clothes?" he asked. "To the king's court, to woo the princess. Haven't you heard what the king's drummer is proclaiming all over the country?" Then they told him about it. "Gracious," said Clumsy Hans, "I guess I'll go too." But his brothers only burst out laughing at him as they rode away. "Father," shouted Clumsy Hans, "let me have a horse. I feel like getting married too. If she takes me, she takes me. And if she doesn't take me, I'll take her anyway." "That's a lot of nonsense," replied his father. "You'll get no horse from me. Why, you don't know how to talk properly. Now, your brothers are intelligent men. If I can't have a horse, I'll take the billy goat," said Clumsy Hans. "He belongs to me, and he can carry me very well." So he mounted the billy goat, dug his heels into its sides, and galloped off down the highway. "Alley-oop! What a ride! Here I come!" shouted Clumsy Hans, singing so loud that his voice was heard far away. But his 2 brothers rode quietly on ahead of him. They were not speaking a word to each other, for they were thinking about all the clever speeches they would have to make, and of course, these had to be carefully prepared and memorized beforehand. "Hello!" cried Clumsy Hans. "Here I come. Look what I found on the road." Then he showed them a dead crow he had picked up. "Clumsy," said the brothers, "what are you going to do with that?" "Why, I am going to give it to the princess." "Yes, you do that," they said, as they rode on laughing. "Hello, here I come again. Just look what I've found this time. You don't find things like this in the road every day." So the brothers turned around to see what it was this time. "Clumsy," they said. "That's just an old wooden shoe, and the upper part's broken off anyway. Is the princess going to have that too?" "She certainly is," replied Hans, and the brothers again laughed and rode on far in advance of him. "Hello! Here I am again!" shouted Clumsy Hans. "Now this is getting better and better. This is really something." "Well, what have you found this time?" asked the brothers. "Oh, I can't really tell you," Clumsy Hans said. "How pleased the princess will be." Said the brothers. "Why, it's nothing but mud out of the ditch." "Yes, of course," said Clumsy Hans, "but the very finest sort of mud. Look, it runs right through your fingers." Then he filled his pockets with it. But his brothers galloped on ahead as fast as they could, and so they arrived at the town gate a full hour ahead of Hans. At the gate, each suitor was given a numbered ticket, and as fast as they arrived, they were arranged in rows, 6 to a row, packed together so tightly that they could not even move their arms. That was a wise plan, for otherwise they could have cut each other's backs to pieces, just because one stood in front of another. All the inhabitants of the town stood around the castle, peering in through the windows to watch the princess receive her suitors. But as each young man came into the room, he became tongue-tied. "No good," said the princess. "Take him away." Now came the brother who had memorized the dictionary, but he had completely forgotten it while standing in line. The floor creaked under his footsteps, and the ceiling was made of mirrors so that he could see himself standing on his head. And at each window stood 3 clerks and an alderman, writing down every word that was spoken, so that it immediately could be printed in the newspapers and sold for 2 pennies on the street corners. It was a terrible ordeal. And besides, there were such fires in the stoves that the pipe was red hot. "It's terribly hot in here," said the suitor. "That's because my father is roasting chickens today," said the princess. "Bah!" There he stood. He was not ready for a speech of this kind, and hadn't a word to say, just when he wanted to say something extremely witty. "Bah! No good," said the princess. "Take him away." And consequently, he had to leave. Now the second brother approached. "It's dreadfully warm here," he said. "Yes, we're roasting chickens today," replied the princess. What did you... what?" he stammered, and all the clerks carefully wrote down, What did you, what?" "No good," said the princess again. "Out with him." Now it was Clumsy Hans's turn, and he rode his billy goat right into the hall. "Terribly hot in here," he said. "I'm roasting young chickens," replied the princess. "Why, that's fine," said Clumsy Hans. "Then I suppose I can get my crow roasted?" "That you can," said the princess. "But have you anything to roast it in?" "I haven't any pots or pans." "But I have," replied Clumsy Hans. "Here's a cooking pot, with a tin handle. Then he pulled out the old wooden shoe and put the crow right into it. "Why, that's enough for a whole meal," said the princess. "But where do we get the sauce from?" "I have that in my pocket," replied Clumsy Hans. "In fact, I have so much I can afford to spill some of it." Then he poured a little of the mud from his pocket. "I like that," said the princess. "You have an answer for everything, and you know how to speak. I'll take you for my husband. But do you know that everything we've said and are saying is written down and will be published in the paper tomorrow? Look over there, and you'll see in each window 3 clerks and an old alderman. And that alderman is the worst of all. He doesn't understand anything." She said this only to frighten him, but all the clerks chuckled with delight and spurted blots of ink on the floor. "Oh, so these are the gentlemen," said Clumsy Hans. "Then I must give the alderman the best thing I have." Then he turned out his pockets and threw the wet mud in the face of the alderman. "Cleverly done," said the princess. "I could never have done that, but I'll learn in time." So Clumsy Hans was made a king with a wife and a crown, and sat on a throne. And we had this story straight from the alderman's newspaper, but that is one you can't always depend upon. Ib and Little Christina. In the forest that extends from the banks of the Gudenau in North Jutland, a long way into the country, and not far from the clear stream, rises a great ridge of land, which stretches through the wood like a wall. Westward of this ridge, and not far from the river, stands a farmhouse, surrounded by such poor land that the sandy soil shows itself between the scanty ears of rye and wheat which grow in it. Some years have passed since the people who lived here cultivated these fields. They kept 3 sheep, a pig, and 2 oxen. In fact, they maintained themselves very well. They had quite enough to live upon, as people generally have who are content with their lot. They even could have afforded to keep 2 horses, but it was a saying among the farmers in those parts, "The horse eats himself up." That is to say, he eats as much as he earns. Jeppe Jans cultivated his fields in summer, and in the winter he made wooden shoes. He also had an assistant, a lad who understood as well as he himself did how to make wooden shoes strong, but light, and in the fashion. They carved shoes and spoons, which paid well. Therefore, no one could justly call Jeppe Jans and his family poor people. Little Ib, a boy of 7 years old and the only child, would sit by, watching the workmen or cutting a stick, and sometimes his finger instead of the stick. But one day, Ib succeeded so well in his carving that he made 2 pieces of wood look really like 2 little wooden shoes. And he determined to give them as a present to little Christina. And who was little Christina? She was the boatman's daughter, graceful and delicate as the child of a gentleman. Had she been dressed differently, no one would have believed that she lived in a hut on the neighboring heath with her father. He was a widower and earned his living by carrying firewood in his large boat from the forest to the eel pond and eel weir on the estate of Silkeborg, and sometimes even to the distant town of Randers. There was no one under whose care he could leave little Christina, so she was almost always with him in his boat, or playing in the wood among the blossoming heath, or picking the ripe wild berries. Sometimes, when her father had to go as far as the town, he would take little Christina, who was a year younger than Ib, across the heath to the cottage of Jeppe Jans and leave her there. Ib and Christina agreed together in everything. They divided their bread and berries when they were hungry. They were partners in digging their little gardens. They ran and crept and played about everywhere. Once they wandered a long way into the forest and even ventured together to climb the high ridge. Another time, they found a few snipes' eggs in the wood, which was a great event. Ib had never been on the heath where Christina's father lived, nor on the river. But at last came an opportunity. Christina's father invited him to go for a sail in his boat. And the evening before, he accompanied the boatman across the heath to his house. The next morning, early, the 2 children were placed on the top of a high pile of firewood in the boat and sat eating bread and wild strawberries, while Christina's father and his man drove the boat forward with poles. They floated on swiftly, for the tide was in their favor, passing over lakes formed by the stream in its course. Sometimes they seemed quite enclosed by reeds and water plants, yet there was always room for them to pass out. Although the old trees overhung the water and the old oaks stretched out their bare branches as if they had turned up their sleeves and wished to show their knotty, naked arms. Old alder trees, whose roots were loosened from the banks, clung with their fibers to the bottom of the stream, and the tops of the branches above the water looked like little woody islands. The water lilies waved themselves to and fro on the river. Everything made the excursion beautiful. And at last they came to the great eel weir, where the water rushed through the floodgates. And the children thought this a beautiful sight. In those days, there was no factory nor any townhouse, nothing but the great farm with its scanty bearing fields, in which could be seen a few herd of cattle and 1 or 2 farm laborers. The rushing of the water through the sluices and the scream of the wild ducks were almost the only signs of active life at Silkeborg. After the firewood had been unloaded, Christina's father bought a whole bundle of eels and a sucking pig, which were all placed in a basket in the stern of the boat. Then they returned again up the stream, and as the wind was favorable, 2 sails were hoisted, which carried the boat on as well as if 2 horses had been harnessed to it. As they sailed on, they came by chance to the place where the boatman's assistant lived, at a little distance from the bank of the river. The boat was moored, and the 2 men, after desiring the children to sit still, both went on shore. They obeyed this order for a very short time, and then forgot it altogether. First they peeped into the basket containing the eels and the sucking pig. Then they must needs pull out the pig and take it in their hands, and feel it, and touch it. And as they both wanted to hold it at the same time, the consequence was that they let it fall into the water, and the pig sailed away with the stream. Here was a terrible disaster. Ib jumped ashore and ran a little distance from the boat. "Oh, take me with you," cried Christina, and she sprang after him. In a few minutes, they found themselves deep in a thicket, and could no longer see the boat or the shore. They ran on a little farther, and then Christina fell down and began to cry. Ib helped her up and said, "Never mind, follow me. Yonder is the house." But the house was not yonder, and they wandered still farther over the dry, rustling leaves of the last year, and treading on fallen branches that crackled under their little feet. Then they heard a loud, piercing cry, and they stood still to listen. Presently, the scream of an eagle sounded through the wood. It was an ugly cry, and it frightened the children. But before them, in the thickest part of the forest, grew the most beautiful blackberries in wonderful quantities. They looked so inviting that the children could not help stopping, and they remained there so long eating that their mouths and cheeks became quite black with the juice. Presently, they heard the frightful scream again, and Christina said, "We shall get into trouble about that pig." "Oh, never mind," said Ib. "We will go home to my father's house. It is here in the wood." So they went on, but the road led them out of the way. No house could be seen. It grew dark, and the children were afraid. The solemn stillness that reigned around them was now and then broken by the shrill cries of the great horned owl and other birds that they knew nothing of. At last, they both lost themselves in the thicket. Christina began to cry, and then Ib cried too. And after weeping and lamenting for some time, they stretched themselves down on the dry leaves and fell asleep. The sun was high in the heavens when the 2 children woke. They felt cold, but not far from their resting place. On a hill, the sun was shining through the trees. They thought if they went there, they should be warm, and Ib fancied he should be able to see his father's house from such a high spot. But they were far away from home now, in quite another part of the forest. They clambered to the top of the rising ground and found themselves on the edge of a declivity, which sloped down to a clear, transparent lake. Great quantities of fish could be seen through the clear water, sparkling in the sun's rays. They were quite surprised when they came so suddenly upon such an unexpected sight. Close to where they stood grew a hazel bush, covered with beautiful nuts. They soon gathered some, cracked them, and ate the fine young kernels, which were only just ripe. But there was another surprise and fright in store for them. Out of the thicket stepped a tall old woman, her face quite brown, and her hair of a deep shining black. The whites of her eyes glittered like a Moor's. On her back she carried a bundle, and in her hand a knotted stick. She was a gypsy. The children did not at first understand what she said. She drew out of her pocket 3 large nuts, in which she told them were hidden the most beautiful and lovely things in the world, for they were wishing nuts. Ib looked at her, and as she spoke so kindly, he took courage and asked her if she would give him the nuts. And the woman gave them to him, and then gathered some more from the bushes for herself, quite a pocketful. Ib and Christina looked at the wishing nuts with wide open eyes. "Is there in this nut a carriage with a pair of horses?" asked Ib. "Yes, there is a golden carriage with 2 golden horses," replied the woman. "Then give me that nut," said Christina. So Ib gave it to her, and the strange woman tied up the nut for her in her handkerchief. Ib held up another nut. "Is there in this nut a pretty little neckerchief like the one Christina has on her neck?" asked Ib. "There are 10 neckerchiefs in it," she replied, "as well as beautiful dresses, stockings, and a hat and veil." "Then I will have that one also," said Christina, "and it is a pretty one, too." And then Ib gave her the second nut. The third was a little black thing. "You may keep that one," said Christina. "It is quite as pretty." "What is in it?" asked Ib. "The best of all things for you," replied the gypsy. So Ib held the nut very tight. Then the woman promised to lead the children to the right path, that they might find their way home. And they went forward, certainly, in quite another direction, to the one they meant to take. Therefore no one ought to speak against the woman, and say that she wanted to steal the children. In the wild wood path they met a forester who knew Ib, and by his help, Ib and Christina reached home, where they found everyone had been very anxious about them. They were pardoned and forgiven, although they really had both done wrong and deserved to get into trouble. First, because they had let the sucking pig fall into the water, and secondly, because they had run away. Christina was taken back to her father's house on the heath, and Ib remained in the farmhouse on the borders of the wood, near the great land ridge. The first thing Ib did that evening was to take out of his pocket the little black nut, in which the best thing of all was said to be enclosed. He laid it carefully between the door and the doorpost, and then shut the door so that the nut cracked directly. But there was not much kernel to be seen. It was what we should call hollow or worm-eaten, and looked as if it had been filled with tobacco or rich black earth. "It is just what I expected," exclaimed Ib. "How should there be room in a little nut like this for the best thing of all? Christina will find her 2 nuts just the same. There will be neither fine clothes or a golden carriage in them." Winter came, and the new year, many years passed away, until Ib was old enough to be confirmed, and therefore he went during a whole winter to the clergyman of the nearest village to be prepared. One day, about this time, the boatman paid a visit to Ib's parents and told them that Christina was going to service, and that she had been remarkably fortunate in obtaining a good place with most respectable people. "Only think," he said, "she is going to the rich innkeepers at the hotel in Herning, many miles west from here. She is to assist the landlady in the housekeeping, and if afterwards she behaves well and remains to be confirmed, the people will treat her as their own daughter." So Ib and Christina took leave of each other. People already called them the betrothed, and at parting, the girl showed Ib the 2 nuts, which she had taken care of ever since the time that they lost themselves in the wood. And she told him also that the little wooden shoes he once carved for her when he was a boy, and gave her as a present, had been carefully kept in a drawer ever since. And so they parted. After Ib's confirmation, he remained at home with his mother, for he had become a clever shoemaker, and in summer managed the farm for her quite alone. His father had been dead some time, and his mother kept no farm servants. Sometimes, but very seldom, he heard of Christina through a postilion or eel seller who was passing. But she was well off with the rich innkeeper, and after being confirmed, she wrote a letter to her father, in which was a kind message to Ib and his mother. In this letter, she mentioned that her master and mistress had made her a present of a beautiful new dress and some nice underclothes. This was, of course, pleasant news. One day in the following spring, there came a knock at the door of the house where Ib's old mother lived. And when they opened it, lo and behold, in stepped the boatman and Christina. She had come to pay them a visit and to spend the day. A carriage had to come from the Herning Hotel to the next village, and she had taken the opportunity to see her friends once more. She looked as elegant as a real lady and wore a pretty dress, beautifully made on purpose for her. There she stood, in full dress, while Ib wore only his working clothes. He could not utter a word. He could only seize her hand and hold it fast in his own. But he felt too happy and glad to open his lips. Christina, however, was quite at her ease. She talked and kissed him in the most friendly manner, even afterwards, when they were left alone. And she asked, "Did you know me again, Ib?" He still stood holding her hand and said at last, "You are become quite a grand lady, Christina, and I am only a rough working man. But I have often thought of you and of old times." Then they wandered up the great ridge and looked across the stream to the heath, where the little hills were covered with the flowering broom. Ib said nothing. But before the time came for them to part, it became quite clear to him that Christina must be his wife. Had they not, even in childhood, been called the betrothed? To him, it seemed as if they were really engaged to each other, although not a word had been spoken on the subject. They had only a few more hours to remain together, for Christina was obliged to return that evening to the neighboring village, to be ready for the carriage which was to start the next morning early for Herning. Ib and her father accompanied her to the village. It was a fine moonlight evening, and when they arrived, Ib stood holding Christina's hand in his, as if he could not let her go. His eyes brightened, and the words he uttered came with hesitation from his lips, but from the deepest recesses of his heart. "Christina, if you have not become too grand, and if you can be contented to live in my mother's house as my wife, we will be married someday. But we can wait for a while." "Oh, yes," she replied. "Let us wait a little longer, Ib. I can trust you, for I believe that I do love you. But let me think it over." Then he kissed her lips, and so they parted. On the way home, Ib told the boatman that he and Christina were as good as engaged to each other, and the boatman found out that he had always expected it would be so, and went home with Ib that evening, and remained the night in the farmhouse. But nothing further was said of the engagement. During the next year, 2 letters passed between Ib and Christina. They were signed, "Faithful till death." But at the end of that time, one day, the boatman came over to see Ib. With a kind greeting from Christina, he had something else to say, which made him hesitate in a strange manner. At last, it came out that Christina, who had grown a very pretty girl, was more lucky than ever. She was courted and admired by everyone, but her master's son, who had been home on a visit, was so much pleased with Christina that he wished to marry her. He had a very good situation in an office at Copenhagen, and as she had also taken a liking for him, his parents were not unwilling to consent. But Christina, in her heart, often thought of Ib, and knew how much he thought of her, so she felt inclined to refuse this good fortune, added the boatman. At first, Ib said not a word, but he became as white as the wall, and shook his head gently. And then he spoke. Christina must not refuse this good fortune. Then, will you write a few words to her? Said the boatman. Ib sat down to write, but he could not get on at all. The words were not what he wished to say, so he tore up the page. The following morning, however, a letter lay ready to be sent to Christina, and the following is what he wrote. The letter written by you to your father I have read, and see from it that you are prosperous in everything, and that still better fortune is in store for you. Ask your own heart, Christina, and think over carefully what awaits you if you take me for your husband, for I possess very little in the world. Do not think of me or of my position. Think only of your own welfare. You are bound to me by no promises, and if in your heart you have given me one, I release you from it. May every blessing and happiness be poured out upon you, Christina. Heaven will give me the heart's consolation. Ever your sincere friend, Ib. This letter was sent, and Christina received it in due time. In the course of the following November, her banns were published in the church on the heath, and also in Copenhagen, where the bridegroom lived. She was taken to Copenhagen under the protection of her future mother-in-law, because the bridegroom could not spare time from his numerous occupations for a journey so far into Jutland. On the journey, Christina met her father at one of the villages through which they passed, and here he took leave of her. Very little was said about the matter to Ib, and he did not refer to it. His mother, however, noticed that he had grown very silent and pensive. Thinking as he did of old times, no wonder the 3 nuts came into his mind, which the gypsy woman had given him when a child, and of the 2 which he had given to Christina. These wishing nuts, after all, had proved true fortune-tellers. One had contained a gilded carriage and noble horses, and the other, beautiful clothes. All of these Christina would now have in her new home at Copenhagen. Her part had come true, and for him, the nut had contained only black earth. The gypsy woman had said it was the best for him. Perhaps it was, and this also would be fulfilled. He understood the gypsy woman's meaning now. The black earth, the dark grave, was the best thing for him now. Again, years passed away, not many, but they seemed long years to Ib. The old innkeeper and his wife died one after the other, and the whole of their property, many $1,000s, was inherited by their son. Christina could have the golden carriage now, and plenty of fine clothes. During the 2 long years which followed, no letter came from Christina to her father, and when at last her father received one from her, it did not speak of prosperity or happiness. Poor Christina! Neither she nor her husband understood how to economize or save, and the riches brought no blessing with them, because they had not asked for it. Years passed, and for many summers the heath was covered with bloom. In winter, the snow rested upon it, and the rough winds blew across the ridge under which stood Ib's sheltered home. One spring day, the sun shone brightly, and he was guiding the plow across his field. The plowshare struck against something which he fancied was a firestone, and then he saw, glittering in the earth, a splinter of shining metal, which the plow had cut from something which gleamed brightly in the furrow. He searched and found a large, golden armlet of superior workmanship, and it was evident that the plow had disturbed a Hun's grave. He searched further and found more valuable treasures, which Ib showed to the clergyman, who explained their value to him. Then he went to the magistrate, who informed the president of the Museum of the Discovery, and advised Ib to take the treasures himself to the president. "You have found in the earth the best thing you could find," said the magistrate. "The best thing," thought Ib. "The very best thing for me, and found in the earth. Well, if it really is so, then the gypsy woman was right in her prophecy." So Ib went in the ferry boat from Aarhus to Copenhagen. To him, who had only sailed once or twice on the river near his own home, this seemed like a voyage on the ocean. And at length he arrived at Copenhagen. The value of the gold he had found was paid to him. It was a large sum, $600. Then Ib of the Heath went out and wandered about in the great city. On the evening before the day, he had settled to return with the captain of the passage boat. Ib lost himself in the streets and took quite a different turning to the one he wished to follow. He wandered on till he found himself in a poor street of the suburb called Christian's Haven. Not a creature could be seen. At last, a very little girl came out of one of the wretched-looking houses, and Ib asked her to tell him the way to the street he wanted. She looked up timidly at him and began to cry bitterly. He asked her what was the matter, but what she said he could not understand. So he went along the street with her, and as they passed under a lamp, the light fell on the little girl's face. A strange sensation came over Ib as he caught sight of it. The living, breathing embodiment of little Christina stood before him, just as he remembered her in the days of her childhood. He followed the child to the wretched house and ascended the narrow, crazy staircase which led to a little garret in the roof. The air in the room was heavy and stifling. No light was burning, and from one corner came sounds of moaning and sighing. It was the mother of the child who lay there on a miserable bed. With the help of a match, Ib struck a light and approached her. "Can I be of any service to you?" he asked. "This little girl brought me up here, but I am a stranger in this city. Are there no neighbors or anyone whom I can call?" Then he raised the head of the sick woman and smoothed her pillow. He started as he did so. It was Christina of the Heath. No one had mentioned her name to Ib for years. It would have disturbed his peace of mind, especially as the reports respecting her were not good. The wealth which her husband had inherited from his parents had made him proud and arrogant. He had given up his certain appointment and traveled for 6 months in foreign lands, and on his return had lived in great style and got into terrible debt. For a time, he had trembled on the high pedestal on which he had placed himself, till at last he toppled over, and ruin came. His numerous merry companions and the visitors at his table said it served him right, for he had kept house like a madman. One morning, his corpse was found in the canal. The cold hand of death had already touched the heart of Christina. Her youngest child, looked for in the midst of prosperity, had sunk into the grave when only a few weeks old. And at last, Christina herself became sick unto death, and lay, forsaken and dying, in a miserable room. Amid poverty she might have borne in her younger days, but which was now more painful to her from the luxuries to which she had lately been accustomed. It was her eldest child, also a little Christina, whom Ib had followed to her home, where she suffered hunger and poverty with her mother. It makes me unhappy to think that I shall die and leave this poor child, sighed she. Oh, what will become of her? She could say no more. Then Ib brought out another match and lighted a piece of candle which he found in the room, and it threw a glimmering light over the wretched dwelling. Ib looked at the little girl and thought of Christina in her young days. For her sake, could he not love this child, who was a stranger to him? As he thus reflected, the dying woman opened her eyes and gazed at him. Did she recognize him? He never knew, for not another word escaped her lips. In the forest by the river Gudenau, not far from the heath, and beneath the ridge of land, stood the little farm, newly painted and whitewashed. The air was heavy and dark. There were no blossoms on the heath. The autumn winds whirled the yellow leaves towards the boatman's hut, in which strangers dwelt. But the little farm stood safely sheltered beneath the tall trees and the high ridge. The turf blazed brightly on the hearth, and within was sunlight, the sparkling light from the sunny eyes of a child, the bird-like tones from the rosy lips ringing like the song of a lark in spring. All was life and joy. Little Christina sat on Ib's knee. Ib was to her both father and mother. Her own parents had vanished from her memory, as a dream picture vanishes alike from childhood and age. Ib's house was well and prettily furnished, for he was a prosperous man now, while the mother of the little girl rested in the churchyard at Copenhagen, where she had died in poverty. Ib had money now, money which had come to him out of the black earth, and he had Christina for his own, after all. The Thorny Road of Honor. There is an old fairy tale. The Thorny Road of Honor was trodden by a marksman named Bride, to whom came great honor and dignity, but not until after manifold adversities and peril of life. More than one of us had heard that tale in childhood, and perhaps read it in later years, and thought of his own unsung thorny road and manifold adversities. Romance and reality are very nearly alike, but romance has its harmonious ending here on earth, while reality more often delays it and leads us to time and eternity. The history of the world is a magic lantern, showing us picture slides against the dark backgrounds of the ages, of how the benefactors of mankind, the martyrs of progress, have trodden their thorny roads of honor. From all times, from all lands, these pictures of splendor come to us. Each picture lasts a moment only, yet it is a whole lifetime of struggles and triumphs. Let us glance at a few in the ranks of the narrators. NB dies martyrs, those ranks which will never be filled until earth itself shall pass away. We see a crowded theater. The clouds of Aristophanes is sending forth to the audience a river of mirth and mockery. The stage of Athens is ridiculing, in both body and mind, her most remarkable man, who was the shield and defense of the people against the 30 tyrants. Socrates, who in the heat of battle rescued Alcibiades and Xenophon, whose spirit soared above the deities of the ancient world, is here in person. He has risen from the spectator's bench and has stepped forward, so that the mocking Athenians may decide whether he and the stage caricature resemble each other. There he stands erect before them, and in high spirit he is high above them. You green, juicy, poisonous hemlock, be you, and not the olive tree, the shadowy symbol of this Athens. 7 cities claimed to be the birthplace of Homer, that is, after he was dead. But look at him, in his lifetime. Through these same cities he wanders, reciting his verses for a pittance. Care for the morrow turns his hair gray. He, mightiest of seers, is blind and alone, and the sharp thorns tear the mantle of the king of poesy. His songs yet live, and in them alone live still the gods and heroes of olden times. Picture after picture leaps forth from the morning land and the evening land, far separated by time and space, yet all with the same thorny path, where the thistle never bears blossoms till it adorns the grave. Under the palm trees walk swaying camels, laden with indigo and other precious gifts, sent by the ruler of the land to him whose songs are the people's delight and the country's pride. He whom spite and slander drove into exile is found again, for the caravan draws near the little town where he has taken refuge. But a poor corpse is being carried out of the gate, and the caravan is stopped. The dead is the very man they seek, Firdausi. Ended is his thorny road of honor. There sits an African Negro with blunt features, thick lips, and black kinky hair, begging on the marble steps of the palace in Portugal's capital. He is the faithful slave of Camoens. If it were not for him and the coppers that he begs, his master, the singer of the Lusiad, would have starved to death. Now, an expensive monument rises over the grave of Camoens. Still another picture. Behind iron bars, a man appears, ghostly white, with a long and matted beard. "I have made an invention," he cries, "the greatest in centuries, and for more than 20 years they have kept me caged up here." "Who is he?" "A lunatic," replies the keeper. What crazy ideas a man may get. He thinks people could move along by steam power. It is Salomon de Causse, inventor of the steam engine. His prophetic words have not been clear enough for a Richelieu, and he dies imprisoned in a madhouse. Here stands Columbus, whom once street boys pursued and mocked at because he would discover a new world. He has discovered it. The bells of jubilation ring at his triumphant return. But soon, the bells of envy sound more loudly still. The world discoverer who raised the American land of gold from the ocean and gave it to his king is rewarded with chains of iron. He asks that they be laid in his coffin to show the world how a man is valued in his own age. Picture rushes after picture, for rich is the thorny road of honor. Here, in dismal gloom, sits he who measured the heights of the moon mountains, who forced his way out among the planets and stars of space mighty Galileo, who could see and hear the earth itself turning beneath him. Blind and deaf, he sits now in his old age, suffering racking pain and neglect, hardly able to lift his foot, that foot which once, when the words of truth were blotted out, he stamped on the earth in mental agony, crying out, "Yet it moves, ah." Here stands a woman with the heart of a child, with inspiration and faith. She bears her banner before the fighting army and brings victory and freedom to her motherland. There is shouting, and the fire burns high. Joan of Arc, the witch, is burned at the stake. Yes, the coming age will spit upon the white lily. Voltaire, wit's own satyr, will sing of La Pucelle. At the Weibo thing, the nobles of Denmark are burning the king's laws. They burst into flames that light up both age and lawmaker, and send a flash of glory into a dark dungeon tower. There he sits, gray-haired, bent, digging at the stone table with his fingers. Once he ruled over 3 kingdoms, the popular leader, friend of townfolk and peasant alike, Christian II, he of the hard will in a hard age. Enemies wrote his story. 27 long years of prison, let us remember, when we think of his blood guilt. There sails a ship from Denmark, and a man stands beside the tall mast. For the last time, he looks upon Aveen, Tycho Brahe, who lifted Denmark's name to the stars themselves, and was repaid with scorn and mockery, is setting forth to a foreign land. Heaven is everywhere. What more do I want? Those are his words as he sails away, our most famous man, sure in foreign lands of being honored and free. Yes, free. Ah, if only free from the intolerable pains of this body, sighs a voice to us from across the centuries. What a picture! Griffenfeld, the Danish Prometheus, chained to Munkholm's rocky isle. Now we are in America, beside a large river. A great crowd has gathered there, for it is said that a ship is to sail against wind and tide, to be itself a power against the elements. Robert Fulton is the name of the man who thinks he can do this strange thing. The ship begins its trip, but suddenly it stops. The crowd laughs, whistles, and mocks. His own father mocks with them. Conceit, madness. He has got what was coming to him. Put the crack brain under lock and key. Then a small nail rattles loose. For a moment, it had stopped the machinery. The engines turn the paddle wheels again and cut through the opposition of the waves. The ship moves. The Weaver shuttle of steam turns hours into minutes between all the lands of the world. Mankind, can you realize the happiness of that moment of assurance when the soul understands its mission? That moment when the sorest wounds from the thorny road of honor, even if caused by one's own fault, are healed and forgotten in spiritual health and strength and freedom. When all discords melt into harmony, and men perceive a revelation of God's grace granted to one alone, and by Him made known to all. Then the thorny road of honor shines like a path of glory around the earth. Happy is he who is chosen to be a pilgrim on that road, and through no merit of his own is made one of the master builders of the bridge between God and man. The genius of history wings his mighty way down through the ages and gives us comfort and good cheer and thoughtful peace of mind by showing us, in brilliant pictures against night-dark backgrounds, the thorny road of honor. Not a path that ends like a fairy tale in gladness and triumph here on earth, but one that leads onward and upward, far into time and eternity. The Jewish girl. Among the other children in the charity school was a little Jewish girl, clever and good in fact, the brightest of them all. But there was one class she could not attend, the one where religion was taught, for she was in a Christian school. During the hour of this class, she had her geography book before her to study, or did her arithmetic, but the lessons were quickly learned. And then, though the book might still be open before her, she did not read from it. She listened, and the teacher soon noticed that she listened more intently than any of the rest. "Study your book," said the teacher, gently yet earnestly. But she looked back at him with her black, eager eyes. And when he put his questions to her, as well as the rest, he found she knew more than all the others. She had listened, understood, and kept his words. Her father was a poor but honest man, and when he first brought her to the school, he had given instructions that she should not be taught the Christian faith, but to send her from the room during the scripture lesson might have given offense and raised various thoughts in the minds of the other children in the class. And so she remained. But this could not go on any longer. So the teacher went to her father and explained that he must either take his daughter away from the school or consent to her becoming a Christian. "I cannot bear to see those burning eyes, that sincere yearning thirst of the soul, so to speak, after the words of the gospel," he said. Then her father burst into tears. "I know very little myself of our own faith," he replied, "but her mother was a daughter of Israel, strong and steadfast in her faith. And on her deathbed, I promised her that our child should never receive Christian baptism. That promise I must keep, for to me it is like a pact with God." So the little Jewish girl was taken away from the Christian school. Years had passed. In a humble household, in one of the smallest provincial towns of Jutland, there was a maidservant, a poor girl of the Jewish faith. This was Sarah. Her hair was as black as ebony, and her eyes were dark, yet full of brilliant light, such eyes as you see among the daughters of the East. And the expression in the face of the grown-up girl was still that of the child who sat on the schoolroom bench, listening with eager and wistful eyes. Every Sunday, the sound of the organ and the singing of the congregation sounded from the church, and the tones floated across the street and into the house where the Jewish girl attended diligently and faithfully to her work. Remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy, was her law. But her Sabbath was a day of labor to Christians, and only in her heart could she keep it holy. And that she believed was not enough, but then the thought came to her soul: what do days and hours matter in the sight of God? And on the Sunday of the Christians, she had her own undisturbed hour of devotion. Then, if the sound of the organ and the singing came across to her as she stood behind the sink in the kitchen, even this became a quiet and consecrated spot. Then she would read the treasure and property of her own people, the Old Testament, and that alone. For she kept deep in her heart what her father had told the teacher and herself when she was taken from the school. The promise he had made to her dying mother, that Sarah should not be baptized, nor forsake the faith of her fathers. The New Testament was, and would forever remain, a sealed book to her. And yet she knew much of it, for it shone through the memories of her childhood. One evening, she was sitting in a corner of the living room while her master read aloud. She allowed herself to listen, for this was not the gospel. No, he was reading from an old storybook, so she could remain. The master read to them of a Hungarian knight who was taken captive by a Turkish pasha and yoked with oxen to the plow. He was driven with lashes of the whip and suffered pain and thirst almost beyond endurance. But at home, his wife sold her jewels and mortgaged their castle and lands, while friends contributed large sums to help raise the almost unbelievable amount of money that was demanded as ransom. This finally was collected, and he was delivered from slavery and disgrace. Sick and suffering, he returned home. But soon there resounded over the countryside the summons to a crusade against the foe of Christianity. The sick man heard the call and could have neither peace nor rest any longer. They had to lift him on his war horse. Then the blood rushed again to his cheeks. His strength seemed to return, and he rode forth to victory. The very pasha who had made him suffer pain and humiliation, yoked to the plow, became his captive. He was taken home to the castle dungeon. But before he had been there an hour, the knight came to him and asked his prisoner, "What do you think now awaits you?" "I know," replied the Turk. "Retribution." "Yes, the retribution of a Christian," said the knight. "The teachings of Christ tell us to forgive our enemies and love our fellow men. God is love. Go in peace to your home and loved ones, and be gentle and good to all who suffer." Then the prisoner burst into tears. "How could I have believed such a thing possible?" he cried. "I was certain I would have to suffer shame and torture. Hence I took poison, and within a few hours I shall die. There is no remedy. But before I die, teach me the faith which is so full of such love and mercy. It is great and divine. In that faith, let me die. Let me die a Christian." And his request was granted him. That was the legend, the story that was read to them. All listened to it with close attention, but it sank deepest into the heart of her who sat in the corner, the servant maid, Sarah, the Jewess. Large tears stood in her sparkling coal-black eyes while she sat there as years ago on the school bench and felt the greatness of the gospel. The tears rolled down her cheeks. "Let not my child become a Christian." Her mother's dying words rang through her soul with those of the law. "Honor thy father and thy mother." Still, I have not been baptized. They call me the Jewess. The boys of the neighborhood mocked me last Sunday as I stood outside the church door and looked in at the burning altar lights and the singing congregation. Ever since my school days, up to this very hour, the power of Christianity, which is like a sunbeam, and which, no matter how much I close my eyes, penetrates into my heart. But my mother, I will not bring you sorrow in your grave. I will not betray the promise my father made to you. I will not read the Christian's Bible. Have I not the God of my fathers? On him let me rest my head. And the years rolled by. The husband died, and the wife was left in difficult circumstances. The servant girl had to be dismissed, but Sarah would not leave the widow. She became her help in time of trouble and kept the little household together. She worked late every night, and by the labor of her own hands got bread for the house. There were no close relatives to help a family where the widow grew weaker each day, lingering for months on a sickbed. Gentle and good Sarah watched and nursed and labored and was the blessing of the poverty-stricken home. "There is the Bible," said the sick woman one evening. "Read a little to me. The evening is so long, and I sadly need to hear the Word of God. Sarah bowed her head, picked up the Bible, and folded her hands around it, opened it, and read aloud to the sick woman. Often the tears came into her eyes, but they shone more clearly, and the darkness lifted from her soul. Mother, your child shall not receive the baptism of the Christians, shall not be named in their communion. You have wished it, and I shall honor your wish. In this we are united here on earth, but above this is a greater union in God. He leads and guides us beyond death. I will pour water upon him that is thirsty, and floods upon the dry ground. Oh, I understand now. I do not know myself how I came to it. Through him, it was in him, Christ. And she trembled as she spoke the holy name. A baptism of fire streamed through her, stronger than her feeble frame could bear, and she sank down, more exhausted even than the sick woman whom she nursed. Poor Sarah, people said. She is worn out with labor and nursing. They took her to the charity hospital, and there she died, and thence she was carried to her grave. It was not to the graveyard of the Christians. That was not the place for a Jewish girl. No, outside by the wall, they dug a grave for her. But God's sun, which shines upon the graves of the Christians, shines as well upon that of the Jewish girl. And the hymns, which are sung beside the Christian graves, sound also beside her grave outside the wall. And out there, too, reaches the promise. There is resurrection in Christ, in him, the Savior, who said to his disciples, John truly baptized with water, but ye shall be baptized with the Holy Ghost. A string of pearls. The railroad in Denmark still extends only from Copenhagen to Korsør. It is a string of pearls. Europe has a wealth of these pearls. Its most costly are named Paris, London, Vienna, Naples. And yet, many a man will point out as his favorite pearl not one of these great cities, but rather some little country town that is still the home of homes to him, the home of those dearest to him. Yes, often it is not a town at all, but a single homestead, a little house hidden among green hedges, a place hardly visible as the train speeds by. How many pearls are there on the line from Copenhagen to Korsør? We will consider just 6, which most people must notice. Old memories and poetry itself give a luster to these pearls, so that they shine in our thoughts. Near the hill where stands the palace of Frederick VI, the home of Eulenschläger's childhood, one of these pearls glistens, sheltered by Søndermarken's woody ground. It used to be called the cottage of Philemon and Baucis. Here lived Rabeck and his wife, Kama. Here, under their hospitable roof, assembled many of the generation's finest intellects from busy Copenhagen. It was the festival home of the intellectual. Now, don't say, "Ah, what a change." No, it is still the home of the intellect, a conservatory for sick plants, for buds which do not have the strength to unfold their true beauty of color and form, or show the blossoming and fruit-bearing which is hidden within them. The insane asylum, surrounded by human love, is truly a spot of holiness, a hospital for the sick plants that shall someday be transplanted to bloom in the paradise of God. The weakest minds are assembled now here, where once the strongest and keenest met to exchange thoughts and ideas. But still, the flame of generosity mounts heavenward from the cottage of Philemon and Bautis. Ancient Roskilde, the burial town of kings by Hroar's spring, now lies before us. The slender towers of the church lift up above the low town and mirror themselves in Isefjord. Only one grave shall we seek here. It is not that of the mighty Queen Margrethe. No, within the white-walled churchyard which we speed close by is the grave, and over it lays a small, plain stone. The master of the organ, the reviver of the old Danish romances, rests here. We recall the clear waves rolled, and there dwelt a king in Leira. Roskilde, burial place of kings. In your pearl, we see the insignificant gravestone whereon is cut a lyre and the name Weise. Now we reach Sigersted, near the town of Ringsted. The bed of the river is low here. Yellow corn waves over the spot where Hagbarth's boat lay at anchor, not far from Sina's maiden bower. Who does not know the legend of Hagbarth, who was hanged on the oak tree while the bower of Signa burst into flames? Who can forget that legend of immortal love? Beautiful sorrow, encircled by woods. Your quiet old cloistered town peeps out through its mossy trees. The keen eyes of youth from the academy can look across the lake toward the world's highway and hear the roar of the locomotive's dragon as it speeds through the woods. Sora, pearl of poetry, you are guarding the dust of Holberg. Your palace of learning stands beside the deep woodland lake like a great white swan. And nearby, like the bright star flower of the woods, there gleams a tiny cottage, whence pious hymns echo throughout the land. Words are spoken within, and the peasant listens and learns of Denmark's bygone days. As the song of the bird is to the greenwood, so is Ingemann to Sorrow, on to the town of Slagelse. What is mirrored here in this pearl's luster, gone forever, is the cloister of Antorskov, Antibie, Antvorskov. Vanished are the rich halls of the castle, even the last remaining wing. Yet one relic of olden times still lingers here, the wooden cross on the hill. It has been repaired again and again, for it marks the spot where, legend tells us, Saint Anders, holy priest of Slagelsa, awoke after having been brought there from Jerusalem in a single night. Korsor, birthplace of Bagason, master of words and wit. The ruined old ramparts of the fallen fortress are now the last visible witness of your childhood home. Their lengthening sunset shadows point to the spot where stood the house in which you were born. From these hills you looked toward Sprogo and sang in undying verse. Nowhere have roses so red a hue, and nowhere are feathers so light and so blue, nowhere the thorns so daintily grown as those to childhood innocence known. Humorous, charming singer, we shall weave for thee a garland of woodbine and fling it into the lake, so that the current may bear it to the coast of Keeler Fjord, where your ashes rest. The tide shall bring you a greeting from the new generation, a greeting from your birthplace, Korsor, where I drop my string of pearls. That's quite right. A string of pearls does stretch from Copenhagen to Korsor, said grandmother when she had heard this read aloud. It's a string of pearls for me now, as it was more than 40 years ago. We had no railroad then. We spent days on a trip that can now be made in as many hours. That was in 1815. And I was 21. That is a charming age. Although to be up in the 60s, that is also a wonderful age. In my young days, it was a much rarer event than it is now to come to Copenhagen, which we considered the town of all towns. My parents hadn't visited it for 20 years, but at last they were going, and I was going with them. We had talked about that journey for years before, and now it was actually coming true. It seemed as though a new life were beginning for me. And really, in a way, a new life did begin for me. There was such a bustle of sewing and packing. And when at last we were ready to start, such a crowd of friends came to bid us farewell. It was a long journey we had ahead of us. Shortly before noon, we drove out of Odense in my parents' Holstein carriage, and our friends waved to us from the windows all the way down the street, till we passed through St. Jorgen's Gate. The weather was beautiful. The birds sang, and everything was joyful. We forgot what a long and tiresome road it was to Nyborg. We reached it toward evening, but the little sailing vessel had to wait for the mail, which didn't arrive until night. Then we got on board, and as far as we could see, the wide, smooth waters lay before us. We lay down and went to sleep in our clothes. When I awoke and came on deck next morning, I could see nothing at all. A heavy fog covered everything. When I heard the cocks crowing, I knew it must be sunrise. Bells were ringing, but I didn't know where. Then the mist lifted, and we found we were still lying very close to Neuburg. Later in the day, a wind came up, but it was against us. We tacked back and forth, and at last were lucky enough to reach Corsor by a little past 11 that night, having spent 22 hours to go 16 miles. It was good to get ashore, but it was dark. The lamps were weak, and it all seemed very strange to me, who had never been in any other town but Odense. "Look," said my father. "Baggesen was born there, and Berkner lived in that house." When I heard that, somehow the dark old town with its narrow little streets seemed to grow larger and brighter. And we were so glad to feel solid earth under our feet. There was no sleep for me that night, for I was so excited over all that I had seen and heard since I had left home the day before. Next morning, we had to leave early. There was a terrible road ahead of us, with great bumps and holes as far as Slagelse, and not much better from there on. And we wanted to get to the Crab Inn early, so that on the same day we could reach Soro and visit the Moller's Emil, as we called him then. Yes, he was your grandfather, my late husband, the dean. He was a student at Soro then, and had just passed his second examination. That afternoon, we reached the Crab Inn, which was a gallant place at that time, the very best inn on the whole trip, with the prettiest country around it. Yes, but you must all admit that it still is. Madame Plambeck was an industrious hostess, and everything in her house was as smoothly scoured as a larding board. On the wall they had, framed under glass, Baggesen's letter to her. It was indeed worth seeing, and I greatly enjoyed looking at it. Then he went to Sora and found Emil there. You can imagine how glad we were to see him, and he to see us. He was so thoughtful and charming. He took us to see the church, and the graves of Absalon and Holberg. He inspected the old monkish inscriptions with us, and sailed with us across the lake to Parnasset. It was the most wonderful evening I remember. I was thinking that to become a poet, one had only to come to Sora and meditate among those lovely, peaceful scenes. By moonlight, we followed the Philosopher's Walk, as it's called, the wonderful and lonely little path beside the lake that joins the highway near the Crab Inn. Emil stayed for supper with us, and my father and my mother declared he had grown so sensible and looked so well. It was almost Whitsuntide, and he promised that in a few days he would be in Copenhagen to to join us and his family. Ah, those few hours in sorrow, and at the Crab Inn, I count among the choicest pearls of my life. Next morning, we again started very early, for we had a long trip to Roskilde, where we wanted to see the church, and Father wanted to visit an old school friend that evening. We spent that night in Roskilde and reached Copenhagen by noon the next day. So we had spent about 3 days on a journey that can now be made in 3 hours, Korsør to Copenhagen. The pearls on that way have not grown more costly, that could never be. But the string is new and wonderful. I stayed with my parents in Copenhagen for 3 weeks. Emil was with us for 18 whole days, and when we returned to Funen, he went with us as far as Korsør. There, before we parted, we were betrothed. So it is no wonder I should call the road from Copenhagen to Korsør a string of pearls. Afterwards, when Emil received his post at Assens, we were married. We often talked about that journey to Copenhagen and intended doing it again. But then your mother came along, and after her came her brothers and sisters, and with all of them, there was so much to do and take care of. Then your grandfather was promoted and made a dean. Yes, everything was happiness and joy. But we never got to Copenhagen again. No, I have never been there since, though we often thought and talked about it. Now I'm much too old to travel by rail, but still, I'm right glad there is a railway. It's a real blessing, because it brings you young ones to me more quickly. Nowadays, Odense is hardly farther from Copenhagen than in my youth it was from Nyborg. You can speed to Italy in the time it took us to reach Copenhagen. Yes, that is certainly something. It doesn't matter that I just sit here always. Let the others travel, so long as they sometimes travel to me. And you needn't laugh at me, you young people, for sitting so still here, day after day. I have really a wonderful journey ahead of me. I shall soon have to travel at a speed far greater than the railways. For when our Lord calls me, shall go to join your grandfather, and when you have completed your work on this dear earth, you too will join us. And then, if we talk over the days of our mortal life, believe me, dear children, I shall say then as I do now. From Copenhagen to Korsør is a perfect string of pearls. The bell deep. Ding dong, echoes faintly from the mysterious depths of the Odense River. But what sort of river is this? Why, every child born in the town of Odense knows it as well as their own street. It winds gently through the heart of the town, slipping past the foot of gardens, gliding under the old wooden bridges, and whispering secrets to the reeds and lilies along its banks. The yellow water lilies float like little suns upon its surface, while brown, feather-like reeds nod their slender heads to the current. And higher still, black, velvety bulrushes rise in proud clusters, so tall and dense that even the midday light can hardly break through. Old willows lean over the water, their roots clutching the muddy banks like tired fingers. Their trunks are hollow, bent, and twisted, with silver bark peeling away in places. They stand as if weary with age, drooping sadly above the slow water near the monk's marsh and the pale, mist-covered meadows. Yet not far above that lonely stretch, the gardens begin, each one with its own soul, its own story. Some bloom in perfect order, with straight little paths and clean, painted arbors so neat they might have been made for dolls. Others are wilder, filled with tangles of cabbages and herbs, their fences leaning, their soil fragrant with the honest scent of earth. And still others have given themselves entirely to nature's hand, where old elder trees spread thick branches out over the flowing river, shading it until the water runs dark and still. In places, it is so deep that even an oar cannot find the bottom. But the very deepest point lies directly across from what once was the old nunnery. That shadowed hollow is known as the Bell Deep, and there, so the elders tell us, dwells the ancient merman. By day he sleeps in the green gloom, where sunlight filters through the ripples in trembling ribbons of gold. But on quiet nights, when stars are sharp and the moon is high, he rises from his watery chamber and listens to the world above. He is very old, older, grandmother says, than any living man could remember. Her own grandmother had spoken of him when she was a little girl. He lives there still, lonely and silent, with only one companion, the great bell that once hung in the steeple of St. Albans Church. Once, long ago, that bell had rung, bright and proud. Ding dong, ding dong. It sang over the rooftops, calling the townsfolk to prayer, proclaiming weddings and deaths, christenings and festivals. But one red evening, when the sun sank low and the whole river glowed like molten gold, the bell broke free from its wooden beam. As it fell, the crimson light glimmered on its bronze surface, and it seemed almost alive, almost joyous. Ding dong, now I go to my rest, it cried as it plunged into the deepest part of the Odense River. That is how the place came to be called the Bell Deep. Yet the bell found no peace there. It neither slept nor rusted away. Even now, on still nights, one can hear it faintly through the dark waters, a trembling sound, like a sigh from another world. Many people whisper that it tolls to foretell the death of someone in the town. But no, that is not its purpose. It rings to speak with the merman, for he is lonely, and the bell is his only friend beneath the river. And what stories the bell tells, for it is ancient, cast long before grandmother's grandmother was born, though even it is but a child beside the merman. The merman himself is a curious figure, quiet, solemn, and strange. His trousers are made from the sleek skins of eels, his coat from glimmering fish scales decorated with yellow water lilies. Brown bulrushes sprout from his hair, and little duckweeds cling to his long beard. He is not beautiful, no, but there is something noble in his sadness, something as deep and secret as the river itself. When the bell speaks, its tales roll out in long, slow echoes, swelling and softening like the tide. It remembers everything, the times of joy and sorrow, the triumphs and cruelties of mankind. Sometimes it grows weary of repetition and shortens the story. At other times, it grows passionate and tells it with the power of a storm. Always, it begins the same way. Ding dong, ding dong. Once it tells of a young monk who climbed the tower of St. Albans. He was handsome, but troubled, with eyes dear as thought itself. He leaned at the narrow window, gazing out over the broad river. In those days, the marshes were still a great lake, glimmering like glass. Across the water rose a green rampart called the Nun's Hill, and beyond that stood the quiet cloister. From one high window burned a single light, the lamp of a nun he had once known. His heart trembled as he saw it. Ding dong, sighed the bell, remembering. Another time, it tells of a foolish servant of the bishop who climbed the tower to play beneath it. The great bell swung above his head, and when it rang, the air shuddered. He sat right beneath it, tapping two sticks together as if he played a secret tune. He sang softly, "Here I may dare to sing what elsewhere I dare not whisper. There are secrets behind locks and bolts where the air is damp and the rats devour the living. No one sees, no one hears, except the bell that cries above, 'Ding dong, ding dong.'" And the bell remembers the story of King Knud, the pious one who bowed before bishops but turned cruel to his people. He demanded too much, and the folk of Vendelbo rose against him with weapons and wild fury. He fled to St. Albans and barred the doors. The mob surrounded the church. Even the crows and ravens were frightened and circled the steeple. crying to one another. Inside, the king prayed before the altar, guarded by his brothers, Eric and Benedict. But treachery found its way in. His servant Blake betrayed him, and through the window came a stone that struck the king dead where he knelt. The birds shrieked, the mob roared, and the bell rang out in anguish. Ding dong, ding dong. The bell had seen so much from its high place: storms and weddings, deaths and festivals, sins and prayers. The birds came to rest upon its rim and told it their secrets. The wind whispered to it through the tower slits. The wind, you see, knows all things. It moves among all living creatures. It fills our lungs, hears our words and sighs, and carries them through the sky. And when the bell heard these things, it too repeated them, pealing them out for the world to hear. Ding dong, ding dong. But in time, the weight of all it had heard grew too great to bear. The sorrow of mankind, the cries of the dead, the songs of the lost, all pressed upon its bronze heart until the wooden beam cracked beneath it. And so the bell fell, flaming in the sunset, down into the depths of the Odense River, where it lies to this day beside the lonely merman. And there, through the endless years, it still murmurs its stories to him, of what it saw, of what it knew. Ding dong, ding dong. That is what grandmother says. And she heard it from her grandmother before her. But our schoolmaster insists there is no bell down there at all. He says there are no mermen either, that such tales belong to the dreams of children. When the bells ring, he says, it is not metal, but air that makes the sound, for the air carries all things. Yet, grandmother agrees with him on that point, for the bell itself once told her the same truth. The air knows all. It surrounds us, breathes within us, carries our thoughts and deeds to the heavens. It whispers them farther than any bell could reach, beyond the river, beyond the stars, until at last, in the farthest vault of heaven, the great celestial bells take up the sound. Ding dong, forever and ever. The bottleneck. Close to the corner of a street, among other abodes of poverty, stood an exceedingly tall, narrow house, which had been so knocked about by time that it seemed out of joint in every direction. This house was inhabited by poor people, but the deepest poverty was apparent in the garret lodging in the gable. In front of the little window, an old bent bird cage hung in the sunshine, which had not even a proper water glass, but instead of it the broken neck of a bottle, turned upside down, and a cork stuck in to make it hold the water with which it was filled. An old maid stood at the window. She had hung chickweed over the cage, and the little linnet which it contained hopped from perch to perch and sang and twittered merrily. "Yes, it's all very well for you to sing," said the bottleneck. That is, he did not really speak the words as we do, for the neck of a bottle cannot speak. But he thought them to himself in his own mind, just as people sometimes talk quietly to themselves. "Yes, you may sing very well. You have all your limbs uninjured. You should feel what it is like to lose your body and only have a neck and a mouth left, with a cork stuck in it, as I have. You wouldn't sing then, I know. After all, it is just as well that there are some who can be happy. I have no reason to sing, nor could I sing now if I were ever so happy. But when I was a whole bottle and they rubbed me with a cork, didn't I sing then? I used to be called a complete lark. I remember when I went out to a picnic with the furrier's family, on the day his daughter was betrothed. It seems as if it only happened yesterday. I have gone through a great deal in my time, when I come to recollect. I have been in the fire and in the water. I have been deep in the earth, and have mounted higher in the air than most other people. And now I am swinging here, outside a bird cage, in the air and the sunshine. Oh, indeed, it would be worthwhile to hear my history, but I do not speak it aloud, for a good reason, because I cannot. Then the bottleneck related his history, which was really rather remarkable. He, in fact, related it to himself, or at least thought it in his own mind. The little bird sang his own song merrily. In the street below, there was driving and running to and fro. Everyone thought of his own affairs, or perhaps of nothing at all. But the bottleneck thought deeply. He thought of the blazing furnace in the factory, where he had been blown into life. He remembered how hot it felt when he was placed in the heated oven, the home from which he sprang, and that he had a strong inclination to leap out again directly. But after a while, it became cooler, and he found himself very comfortable. He had been placed in a row with a whole regiment of his brothers and sisters, all brought out of the same furnace. Some of them had certainly been blown into champagne bottles, and others into beer bottles, which made a little difference between them. In the world, it often happens that a beer bottle may contain the most precious wine, and a champagne bottle be filled with blacking. But even in decay, it may always be seen whether a man has been well born. Nobility remains noble, as a champagne bottle remains the same, even with blacking in its interior. When the bottles were packed, our bottle was packed amongst them. It little expected then to finish its career as a bottleneck, or to be used as a water glass to a bird's cage, which is, after all, a place of honor, for it is to be of some use in the world. The bottle did not behold the light of day again until it was unpacked with the rest in the wine merchant's cellar, and, for the first time, rinsed with water, which caused some very curious sensations. There it lay empty and without a cork, and it had a peculiar feeling, as if it wanted something it knew not what. At last, it was filled with rich and costly wine. A cork was placed in it and sealed down. Then it was labeled first quality, as if it had carried off the first prize at an examination. Besides, the wine and the bottle were both good. And while we are young is the time for poetry. There were sounds of song within the bottle, of things it could not understand, of green, sunny mountains, where the vines grow, and where the merry vine dressers laugh, sing, and are merry. Ah, how beautiful is life! All these tones of joy and song in the bottle were like the working of a young poet's brain, who often knows not the meaning of the tones which are sounding within him. One morning, the bottle found a purchaser in the furrier's apprentice, who was told to bring one of the best bottles of wine. It was placed in the provision basket with ham and cheese and sausages. The sweetest fresh butter and the finest bread were put into the basket by the furrier's daughter herself, for she packed it. She was young and pretty. Her brown eyes laughed, and a smile lingered round her mouth, as sweet as that in her eyes. She had delicate hands, beautifully white, and her neck was whiter still. It could easily be seen that she was a very lovely girl, and as yet she was not engaged. The provision basket lay in the lap of the young girl as the family drove out to the forest, and the neck of the bottle peeped out from between the folds of the white napkin. There was the red wax on the cork, and the bottle looked straight at the young girl's face, and also at the face of the young sailor who sat near her. He was a young friend, the son of a portrait painter. He had lately passed his examination with honor as mate, and the next morning he was to sail in his ship to a distant coast. There had been a great deal of talk on this subject while the basket was being packed, and during this conversation, the eyes and the mouth of the furrier's daughter did not wear a very joyful expression. The young people wandered away into the green wood and talked together. What did they talk about? The bottle could not say, for he was in the provision basket. It remained there a long time, but when at last it was brought forth, it appeared as if something pleasant had happened, for everyone was laughing. The furrier's daughter laughed too, but she said very little, and her cheeks were like two roses. Then her father took the bottle and the corkscrew into his hands. What a strange sensation it was to have the cork drawn for the first time. The bottle could never after that forget the performance of that moment. Indeed, there was quite a convulsion within him as the cork flew out, and a gurgling sound as the wine was poured forth into the glasses. "Long life to the betrothed," cried the papa, and every glass was emptied to the dregs, while the young sailor kissed his beautiful bride. "Happiness and blessing to you both," said the old people father and mother, and the young man filled the glasses again. "Safe return and a wedding this day next year," he cried. And when the glasses were empty, he took the bottle, raised it on high, and said, "Thou hast been present here on the happiest day of my life. Thou shalt never be used by others." So saying, he hurled it high in the air. The furrier's daughter thought she should never see it again, but she was mistaken. It fell among the rushes on the borders of a little woodland lake. The bottleneck remembered well how long it lay there unseen. "I gave them wine, and they gave me muddy water," he had said to himself, "but I suppose it was all well meant." He could no longer see the betrothed couple, nor the cheerful old people, but for a long time he could hear them rejoicing and singing. At length there came by 2 peasant boys, who peeped in among the reeds and spied out the bottle. Then they took it up and carried it home with them, so that once more it was provided for. At home in their wooden cottage, these boys had an elder brother, a sailor, who was about to start on a long voyage. He had been there the day before to say farewell, and his mother was now very busy packing up various things for him to take with him on his voyage. In the evening, his father was going to carry the parcel to the town to see his son once more and take him a farewell greeting from his mother. A small bottle had already been filled with herb tea, mixed with brandy, and wrapped in a parcel. But when the boys came in, they brought with them a larger and stronger bottle, which they had found. This bottle would hold so much more than the little one, and they all said the brandy would be so good for complaints of the stomach, especially as it was mixed with medical herbs. The liquid which they now poured into the bottle was not like the red wine with which it had once been filled. These were bitter drops, but they are of great use sometimes for the stomach. The new large bottle was to go, not the little one. So the bottle once more started on its travels. It was taken on board, for Peter Jensen was one of the crew, the very same ship in which the young mate was to sail. But the mate did not see the bottle. Indeed, if he had, he would not have known it, or supposed it was the one out of which they had drunk to the felicity of the betrothed and to the prospect of a marriage on his own happy return. Certainly, the bottle no longer poured forth wine, but it contained something quite as good. And so it happened that whenever Peter Jensen brought it out, his messmates gave it the name of the apothecary, for it contained the best medicine to cure the stomach, and he gave it out quite willingly, as long as a drop remained. Those were happy days, and the bottle would sing when rubbed with a cork, and it was called a great lark, Peter Jensen's lark. Long days and months rolled by, during which the bottle stood empty in a corner, when a storm arose. Whether on the passage out or home, it could not tell, for it had never been ashore. It was a terrible storm. Great waves arose, darkly heaving and tossing the vessel to and fro. The main mast was split asunder, the ship sprang a leak, and the pumps became useless, while all around was black as night. At the last moment, when the ship was sinking, the young mate wrote on a piece of paper, "We are going down. God's will be done." Then he wrote the name of his betrothed, his own name, and that of the ship. Then he put the leaf in an empty bottle that happened to be at hand, corked it down tightly, and threw it into the foaming sea. He knew not that it was the very same bottle from which the goblet of joy and hope had once been filled for him. And now it was tossing on the waves with his last greeting. And a message from the dead, the ship sank, and the crew sank with her. But the bottle flew on like a bird, for it bore within it a loving letter from a loving heart. And as the sun rose and set, the bottle felt as at the time of its first existence, when in the heated, glowing stove it had a longing to fly away. It outlived the storms and the calm. It struck against no rocks, was not devoured by sharks, but drifted on for more than a year, sometimes towards the north, sometimes towards the south, just as the current carried it. It was in all other ways its own master, but even of that one may get tired. The written leaf, the last farewell of the bridegroom to his bride, would only bring sorrow when once it reached her hands. But where were those hands, so soft and delicate, which had once spread the tablecloth on the fresh grass in the green wood, on the day of her betrothal? Ah, yes, where was the furrier's daughter? And where was the land which might lie nearest to her home? The bottle knew not. It traveled onward and onward, and at last all this wandering about became wearisome. At all events, it was not its usual occupation, but it had to travel, till at length it reached land, a foreign country. Not a word spoken in this country could the bottle understand. It was a language it had never before heard, and it is a great loss not to be able to understand a language. The bottle was fished out of the water and examined on all sides. The little letter contained within it was discovered, taken out, and turned and twisted in every direction. but the people could not understand what was written upon it. They could be quite sure that the bottle had been thrown overboard from a vessel, and that something about it was written on this paper. But what was written? That was the question. So the paper was put back into the bottle, and then both were put away in a large cupboard of one of the great houses of the town. Whenever any strangers arrived, the paper was taken out and turned over and over, so that the address, which was only written in pencil, became almost illegible, and at last no one could distinguish any letters on it at all. For a whole year, the bottle remained standing in the cupboard, and then it was taken up to the loft, where it soon became covered with dust and cobwebs. Ah, how often then it thought of those better days, of the times when in the fresh green wood it had poured forth rich wine, or, while rocked by the swelling waves, it had carried in its bosom a secret, a letter, a last parting sigh. For full 20 years it stood in the loft, and it might have stayed there longer, but that the house was going to be rebuilt. The bottle was discovered when the roof was taken off. They talked about it, but the bottle did not understand what they said. A language is not to be learnt by living in a loft, even for 20 years. If I had been downstairs in the room, thought the bottle, I might have learnt it. It was now washed and rinsed, which process was really quite necessary. And afterwards, it looked clean and transparent, and felt young again in its old age. But the paper, which it had carried so faithfully, was destroyed in the washing. They filled the bottle with seeds, though it scarcely knew what had been placed in it. Then they corked it down tightly and carefully wrapped it up. There not even the light of a torch or lantern could reach it, much less the brightness of the sun or moon. And yet, thought the bottle, men go on a journey that they may see as much as possible, and I can see nothing. However, it did something quite as important. It traveled to the place of its destination and was unpacked. What trouble they have taken with that bottle over yonder, said one, and very likely it is broken after all. But the bottle was not broken, and better still, it understood every word that was said. This language it had heard at the furnaces and at the wine merchants, in the forest and on the ship. It was the only good old language it could understand. It had returned home, and the language was as a welcome greeting. For very joy, it felt ready to jump out of people's hands, and scarcely noticed that its cork had been drawn, and its contents emptied out, till it found itself carried to a cellar, to be left there and forgotten. There's no place like home, even if it's a cellar. It never occurred to him to think that he might lie there for years. He felt so comfortable. For many long years, he remained in the cellar, till at last some people came to carry away the bottles, and ours amongst the number. Out in the garden, there was a great festival. Brilliant lamps hung in festoons from tree to tree, and paper lanterns through which the light shone till they looked like transparent tulips. It was a beautiful evening, and the weather mild and clear. The stars twinkled, and the new moon, in the form of a crescent, was surrounded by the shadowy disk of the whole moon, and looked like a gray globe with a golden rim. It was a beautiful sight for those who had good eyes. The illumination extended even to the most retired of the garden walks, at least not so retired that anyone need lose himself there. In the borders were placed bottles, each containing a light, and among them the bottle with which we are acquainted, and whose fate it was, one day, to be only a bottleneck, and to serve as a water glass to a bird's cage. Everything here appeared lovely to our bottle, for it was again in the green wood, amid joy and feasting. Again it heard music and song, and the noise and murmur of a crowd, especially in that part of the garden where the lamps blazed, and the paper lanterns displayed their brilliant colors. It stood in a distant walk, certainly, but a place pleasant for contemplation, and it carried a light, and was at once useful and ornamental. In such an hour, it is easy to forget that one has spent 20 years in a loft, and a good thing it is to be able to do so. Close before the bottle passed a single pair, like the bridal pair, the mate and the furrier's daughter, who had so long ago wandered in the wood. It seemed to the bottle as if he were living that time over again. Not only the guests, but other people were walking in the garden, who were allowed to witness the splendor and the festivities. Among the latter came an old maid, who seemed to be quite alone in the world. She was thinking, like the bottle, of the green wood, and of a young betrothed pair, who were closely connected with herself. She was thinking of that hour, the happiest of her life, in which she had taken part, when she had herself been one of that betrothed pair. Such hours are never to be forgotten. Let a maiden be as old as she may. But she did not recognize the bottle. Neither did the bottle notice the old maid. And so we often pass each other in the world when we meet, as did these two, even while together in the same town. The bottle was taken from the garden, and again sent to a wine merchant, where it was once more filled with wine, and sold to an aeronaut, who was to make an ascent in his balloon on the following Sunday. A great crowd assembled to witness the sight. Military music had been engaged, and many other preparations made. The bottle saw it all from the basket in which he lay, close to a live rabbit. The rabbit was quite excited because he knew that he was to be taken up and let down again in a parachute. The bottle, however, knew nothing of the up or the down. He saw only that the balloon was swelling larger and larger till it could swell no more, and began to rise and be restless. Then the ropes which held it were cut through, and the aerial ship rose in the air with the aeronaut and the basket containing the bottle and the rabbit, while the music sounded and all the people shouted, "Hurrah! This is a wonderful journey up into the air," thought the bottle. "It is a new way of sailing, and here, at least, there is no fear of striking against anything." Thousands of people gazed at the balloon, and the old maid who was in the garden saw it also, for she stood at the open window of the garret, by which hung the cage containing the linnet, who then had no water glass, but was obliged to be contented with an old cup. In the window-sill stood a myrtle in a pot, and this had been pushed a little on one side, that it might not fall out, for the old maid was leaning out of the window that she might see, and she did see distinctly the aeronaut in the balloon, and how he let down the rabbit in the parachute, and then drank to the health of all the spectators in the wine from the bottle. After doing this, he hurled it high into the air. How little she thought that this was the very same bottle which her friend had thrown aloft in her honor on that happy day of rejoicing in the green wood in her youthful days. The bottle had no time to think when raised so suddenly, and before it was aware, it reached the highest point it had ever attained in its life. Steeples and roofs lay far, far beneath it, and the people looked as tiny as possible. Then it began to descend much more rapidly than the rabbit had done, made somersaults in the air, and felt itself quite young and unfettered, although it was half full of wine. But this did not last long. What a journey it was! All the people could see the bottle, for the sun shone upon it. The balloon was already far away, and very soon the bottle was far away also, for it fell upon a roof and broke in pieces. But the pieces had got such an impetus in them that they could not stop themselves. They went jumping and rolling about, till at last they fell into the courtyard and were broken into still smaller pieces. Only the neck of the bottle managed to keep whole, and it was broken off as clean as if it had been cut with a diamond. "That would make a capital bird's glass," said one of the cellarmen, but none of them had either a bird or a cage, and it was not to be expected they would provide one just because they had found a bottleneck that could be used as a glass. But the old maid who lived in the garret had a bird, and it really might be useful to her. So the bottleneck was provided with a cork and taken up to her. And, as it often happens in life, the part that had been uppermost was now turned downwards, and it was filled with fresh water. Then they hung it in the cage of the little bird, who sang and twittered more merrily than ever. "Ah, you have good reason to sing," said the bottleneck, which was looked upon as something very remarkable, because it had been in a balloon. Nothing further was known of its history. As it hung there in the bird's cage, it could hear the noise and murmur of the people in the street below, as well as the conversation of the old maid in the room within. An old friend had just come to visit her, and they talked, not about the bottleneck, but of the myrtle in the window. "No, you must not spend $1 for your daughter's bridal bouquet," said the old maid. "You shall have a beautiful little bunch for a nosegay, full of blossoms. Do you see how splendidly the tree has grown? It has been raised from only a little sprig of myrtle that you gave me on the day after my betrothal, and from which I was to make my own bridal bouquet when a year had passed. But that day never came. The eyes were closed, which were to have been my light and joy through life. In the depths of the sea, my beloved sleeps sweetly. The myrtle has become an old tree, and I am a still older woman. Before the sprig you gave me faded, I took a spray and planted it in the earth. And now, as you see, it has become a large tree, and a bunch of the blossoms shall at last appear at a wedding festival in the bouquet of your daughter." There were tears in the eyes of the old maid as she spoke of the beloved of her youth and of their betrothal in the wood. Many thoughts came into her mind, but the thought never came that quite close to her, in that very window, was a remembrance of those olden times, the neck of the bottle, which had, as it were, shouted for joy when the cork flew out with a bang on the betrothal day. But the bottleneck did not recognize the old maid. He had not been listening to what she had related, perhaps because he was thinking so much about her.